Alright, so this is the axle here out of my 53 Chrysler. I had the old bearing cut off and a new bearing rolled in, pressed in. The Timken set, a cone and a cup. So after I pressed it on, I had to try and feed some grease into that bearing. So I just been basically kind of forcing it down into the bearing surface area there through that crack, the end of the bearing, rotating it, just getting it down in there as best as I can. I'm forcing it in, and someone taught me a lesson that I didn't really think about before. It makes sense. This is special grease for wheel bearing grease here, it says, and it's got special additives or whatever elements or whatever you add to the grease to make it really sticky and stay in the bearing as long as possible under heat and pressure. And if you're going to add any wheel bearing grease to your bearings in the future, there's a little grease port on the bottom of the axle housing there where you add grease. You shouldn't mix different types of greases. You should always use wheel bearing grease, because if you add regular moly grease or a lubriplate or something like that, or a general purpose grease, it's going to kind of negate the properties of this grease, and it's going to make this grease kind of rendered useless. It's like having no grease at all, and it kind of makes sense. Think about it. Special grease for your axle. Don't mix it with other grease. So there's probably a better way to do this. I'm not a pro, but I'm just showing you what I've done here to help some people understand how this axle goes together. Again, you can keep pushing that grease in there until it starts to come out the bottom of the bearing. You know you got it in there. And then what I did is when I got the bearing inside and mounted the axle inside the axle housing here, I took a large syringe, filled it with grease, just so that it's low pressure. You don't want to put a ton of pressure up in that grease hole if you can help it. You don't want to. It'll take out the inner axle seal. And I pumped a bunch of grease in there, and I could see it coming through the bearing. And then I knew that I had good grease coverage in throughout that bearing. So this is ready to install now. Keep lots of rags nearby. This stuff is lots of grease. So this axle's already been installed here. You can see outer seal. I got some end play. I'm going to test that later after both axles are installed. This is my syringe that I filled full of grease and pumped it into the back side of that bearing. This bearing sits inside there. So I'm going to install the inner seal first, and I'll show you how to do that, and then we'll put the axle in. Alright, so this is my axle housing here. Shims are all out. There's an inner seal that sits way back in here. Then there's the bearing and the backing plate with the grease seal. So we're going to drive a new seal in here. Sorry, it's a little cramped over here. Didn't leave myself a lot of room driving the car in the garage here. So make sure that's good and clean, best as we can. Our new seal here. Centric parts, made in Taiwan. I don't know, I guess I probably should have looked for NOS seals, but I don't drive this car a ton. We'll see how long it lasts, these Asian parts. So I had a look at the seal. There is no inside or outside marked on this seal. On the one I took out, it did say outside out here. This one doesn't say anything. I compared them. It appears to me that I want to put it, there's a little bit of writing inside of this seal here. I have the writing on the outside. So we're going to set that in. This is the inner seal. What it does is the differential in the center there, it keeps the oil from the differential, which comes out and rests against this seal so the oil does not flow past the seal into the brake assembly. This keeps your differential oil inside. It's the inner seal. Axle goes through that, of course. So I'm going to push that in. So you need some kind of a tool installer, a seal installer or something, or you can get creative and find a nice big chunk of round stock. We call this round steel. It's about, I think it's 2 1/4 inches. It's a real nice, very close fit. It'll give me the coverage I want. And the hammer, and I'll tap that in. But I forgot my hammer. I think I was using a rubber mallet. That big hammer down there. Might be a little bit aggressive. Alright, so we got our seal in the bore. It's tight, it's not going to move. This is the nice square end of this pin. I'll put that in there. Tap it in place. It's going in. It's going to go in a ways yet. It goes in quite a ways. There's a ridge back there. When it stops going in, you know you're there. Clearly, don't overhit it. Alright, so our grease seal is installed. You can see the ridge here, it's in a ways. While I'm in here, I want to show you guys something. Back here on the back side, there's a little plug. It threads into the axle housing right here. That's where you put your grease when you service your car. You do not use a grease gun to put grease in there, because if you put too much pressure, you could damage this inner seal here. So you're supposed to push it in with a low pressure gun or use your thumb or something to push the grease in. It can be fairly time consuming to get that grease in there. So what I do is when I slide my axle shaft in with the bearing, before I finish it up, I take my syringe and pump that full of grease until I see it coming out of the center of the bearing. So I just want to make you guys aware of that. For anyone that's new to this, you want to be greasing that with the proper grease as mentioned. So there's not a lot of light here in a bad spot. So there's my axle shaft ready to go. Try not to let the shaft slide on the grease seal. Sit on it. And let it go into the differential. There. It's in. So my cone will go on here next. I'll push that in. But again, there's the grease fitting. Remember I told you about that? Right here. Put your grease in. It sits in the bearing. So we're going to put our cup, press it in, and the backing plate goes on. After that, put our shims in, first, then our backing plate. And that's kind of how our axle goes together. Alright, so this is the cup part of the bearing. Put a little bit of grease on there. Again, a little more doesn't hurt. And it's a tapered roller bearing, so this is going to go around the bearing. It's a tight fit. It's got to be pushed in. I'm going to use a piece of tube over that. I'm going to hammer it in lightly, not too hard. I don't want to damage anything, but that's going to fit in there real nice and tight, and then we'll have our bearing in place. So my bearing's almost in. I've been using, I couldn't find a real decent piece of tube put around that, so I use something soft, a piece of wood, and I'm using my rubber mallet here to set it in place. Go around. This is my syringe full of wheel bearing grease. I take out that grease plug in behind the wheel. My syringe in there, and watch. I'm filling up that cavity behind the bearing. And you can see grease just starting to come out of there. So I'm going to get some more and do that again until I see more grease coming out. Then I know my bearing is very well greased. Alright, I'm back with some more grease. Let's put that in there again. Give it a little shot. There. See the grease popping out of there? Bearing cavity now is well lubed. And I know I'm in good shape with that bearing being well lubed. There's quite a bit of room back there for grease. I was surprised earlier this spring before I changed my bearings. I sat here for a while and I tried to push grease into that hole with my thumb, and I kept pushing it in and pushing it in. And then later this year, when I went to change my wheel bearings, because I heard one howling, I accessed that grease when I pulled the bearing apart, and I was like, gee, I didn't really get a whole lot in there. Not as much as I thought, so I think this is a good way of making sure it's well lubed. Alright, so now we've got axles in on both sides. You can't really check the end play on the axle, I was told, until both axles are mounted in place. And I put my shims in, the same shims that I took out on the other side, and I torqued it down, and there's no end play here, zero. So I'm going to take out the shims on the other side, start with no shims, and measure end play on the axle here. It's supposed to be between 3 and 8,000 of end play, 3 to 8 thousandths of an inch, and I got nothing. So we'll take those shims out and see how it looks. Alright, I'm going to show you guys how to pull the axle out here. A trick someone taught me online. So the bearing is pushed in here, the axle housing, tapered shaft. You don't have a special puller. This is what someone suggested you do. Make sure the keyway is out of the axle shaft here. Lay your drum back on. Don't push it on, but put the nut on there a few threads. Now this is sloppy. Pull it, use it as a slide. Here you can see my axle is out. Good supply of grease in there. Wasn't that difficult. There you go. Alright, what I've done here is I've reinstalled all the shims that were behind the backing plate here. When I took this apart, I put in new bearings and I put in the new seals, and I reused the shims. So I expect there'll probably be some difference in clearances with a new bearing. So what I've done is I've pushed my axle shaft in as far as I can go here with the shims in place, set up my gauge here at 0. I'm going to measure end play on the axle shaft, and the spec is between 3 and 8 thousandths of an inch, I believe it is. So I put the nut on, so I got kind of something to pull on here. That axle shaft, the splines are a little bit sharp. You can cut your hands on there. So I'm sitting at 0 on the gauge here now, very close to 0. You can see there's 0. I'm going to pull on the shaft, see where we end up. 10 thou. 0, 10. So I have too much play on the shaft. So I'm going to take the backing plate off again, pull out the bearing slightly to give it some more play, just a little bit. I'm going to pull it out of the axle shaft back out a little bit. I'm going to take out about 5 thou in shims or so, I guess, and then place the backing plate back on, tighten down these nuts. That'll set everything into the right depth. Then I'll measure for end play again. So I'll take out one shim. I'm going to do the same on the other side as well, because the end play is shared between the two axles. And I'll retest. Alright, so as you can see, my car is done. I completed the axle assembly. And I reviewed the videos that I took, put it together for this YouTube video to help some people maybe consider tackling the job. It's not that hard to do. You need a few tools. Slide hammer, a couple punches, socket set. But I realized that I kind of missed videotaping how I set up the axle and the shims. This is a shim. This is what's behind the backing plate, and this goes against your axle housing. And your wheel bearing and axle sit right in the middle here. It's behind the wheel. And this shim is about 5 thousandths of an inch. And the way it works is in the very center of your axle, there's a thrust block. It sits in the middle of the diff. And there's an axle on each side pushing against this thrust block. So you want to have, if possible, both axles installed pushing on the thrust block. If they're touching the thrust block and there's no play, you don't have any clearance in your bearing. So you need to be able to adjust the axle so it doesn't go in too far, but just close enough so that there's like between, like I said, 3 and 8 thousandths of play between the axle shaft and the thrust block. And you want the same amount of clearance on each side of that thrust block. So the left axle and the right axle should be shimmed the same, as close as possible. So I showed you in the video that I had about 10 thou of clearance in my axle on the right side when I pulled it. I tried taking out 5 thou off each shim pack on the right and left side, and that added up to 10 thou, right? So then what happened, I put it back together, tested it again, I had 0 clearance. So I wanted to have between 3 and 8 thousandths of clearance, and I didn't have any more shims. These are old. I guess you could make your own. You might be able to find some. They're variable thicknesses. So I went online and asked some questions on a great forum called P15-D24. It's a good forum. And a great member there, he commented and said that it would be okay to take one of these shims out on one side of the axle only. It's such a small amount. We're talking 5 thousandths of an inch here. He said it's such a small amount. You don't have a huge gap between the right side and the left side. So I reassembled, put my shims in, pushed my bearing in, put my shim in, put my backing plate on, both sides. Only the left side, pulled out one shim, put it back together, set up my dial indicator, and measured axle clearance on the bearing there, end play. And I had exactly 2.5 to 3 thou of play on each side. So that was good enough for me. It was very close to exactly spec, is around 3 to 8 thou. So I bolted it all up, torqued it down, put it together, refilled my diff oil with new oil, and set the brakes up, torqued everything down, took it for a drive, and it's running great. Car feels good. It feels a little bit quieter to me. I think that right-hand side bearing was making a little bit of noise. I just assumed it was road noise, but that bearing started to howl a bit, so I decided to change them both, the outers on both sides there. And that's pretty much it. Like I said, I wouldn't be too shy. That was my first time inside of the axle on this car, any axle, especially something this old, and changing the bearings and the seals. And it went pretty smooth. So give it a shot. If you got any questions, hit me up.